This game was played in the World Junior Championship in Dortmund, Germany in 1980. Garry Kasparov, playing white, faces off against Australian Gregory Hjorth. The game starts as a queen's gambit, declined, and Kasparov brings out the king's knight rather than the queen's knight, as is a bit more usual. Black nevertheless adopts the Tarrasch strategy. Usually the Tarrasch is played after knight moves to c3, but it's equally effective against knight f3. This opening has played a major role in Kasparov's career, and he's played both sides of it during his climb to the World Championship. Kasparov follows the usual path of exchanging at d5. The idea is that Black will eventually wind up with an isolated pawn at d4, at least in most of the variations. Kasparov is going to fianchetto the bishop at g2. This strategy has been known for almost a century now as being the best reaction to the Tarrasch defense. The bishop at g2 will aim directly at the weak pawn at d5. Both sides have all of their knights out and are going to take care of castling. Now we've reached the starting position of the classical Tarrasch defense. The normal continuation here is to bring the bishop to g5. When white eventually captures at c5, black's pawn at d5 will be isolated and vulnerable to attack. It is not necessarily weak. In fact, many players, including of course the great Dr. Siegbert Tarrasch, think it is a strong pawn, an asset rather than a weakness. The truth is, the isolated pawn on the d-file has both its plus sides and its minus sides. If you know how to play the position, you can play either side of it. In fact, I often play this as black and also play it as white. The isolated queen pawn is not going to appear. Black chooses a somewhat radical strategy of advancing on the queen side. The idea is to eventually use a queenside pawn storm to break through and promote one of the pawns to a new queen. The price to be paid is that white will be able to operate on the king side and work against the pawn at d5. Moving the knight to e5 is considered the correct reply. Now black can play either actively or passively. Passive play would involve bringing the bishop to e6 to defend the pawn at d5. Active play would consider such things as exchanging knights at e5. Hjorth chooses the quieter variation. Kasparov advances the f-pawn, hoping to drive away the bishop from e6. Now, black creates a more dynamic position by exchanging at e5. Naturally, Kasparov captures toward the center, so that the rook can be used for an attack on the f-file. In any case, the knight, usually the most valiant defender of the king side, is driven away. The knight takes up an active position at e4, challenging white to capture. But white also has a capture at e7. Here, if black captures with the queen, then after the exchange in the center, white not only has a pawn, but it's a very powerful passed pawn. So instead, Hjorth captures at c3, and then at e7. Now, the only strategy available to white is to try to eliminate black's pawn at d5 so that the central pawns can advance. Now, black's going to try to push forward the queenside pawns as quickly as possible. For the moment, the battle seems to be taking place only in the center and on the queen side. Since the queen side belongs to black, Kasparov breaks right away in the center. Now, if black captures at e4, that's going to open up the path for white's d-pawn, and so instead, white will have to contend with something of a blockade on the light squares. It's a very reasonable strategy, and it forced Kasparov to think deeply. He decides to play with some preventative medicine. Black is going to storm forward on the queen side, so Kasparov takes a move to slow that down. Black plays the obvious rook move to d8. It's obvious because the d file is clearly where the action is going to be, and that strong pawn on d4 has to be restrained because sooner or later those other central pawns are going to leave. Clearly this rook belongs at d8 because the other rook is going to have to support the queenside pawn advances. White has absolutely nothing attacking the black king, but chooses to send the queen on a mission on that side of the board. Black gets ready for the day when the white pawn at c3 will be out of the way, after which the c-pawn can advance. The battle lines are drawn. White's going to attack on the king side. Black's got the queen side. The center is dynamic. Anything could happen. Kasparov prepares to double rooks on the f-file. The f7 square looks like it's well defended, but Kasparov is going to throw everything he's got in that direction. After rook c7, which gives black some flexibility on the rooks, being able to double on either the c-file or the d-file, and also adds even more support to f7, which is now defended by bishop, queen, rook, and king. Kasparov doubles, leaving the a-pawn as a sacrifice. Well, black accepts, but really there's more danger on the king's side than might appear at first glance. Kasparov makes the timely capture, and now black can't take back with the bishop because then f7 loses the key defender. For example, so the rook must be used. The sacrifice of the exchange is not a big sacrifice, because that bishop on d5 seems to be every bit as strong as a white rook, and you can just imagine that black can make very good use of the square g2 to checkmate white's king if the queen can be brought to the proper position. So black can quickly obtain counterplay, and it would seem that white has absolutely no way to increase the pressure on f7. The square is defended three ways, it's attacked three ways, white has no more pieces to attack with. But there is a little pawn. What's surprising about this move is that it seems to contribute nothing to the task of deflecting the bishop from f7. But, you see, after the bishop captures, it opens up the d5 square, and the pawn moves up. Well, now if the bishop runs away, f7 will fall. The pawn can't be captured because it's defended by the queen. So, somewhat in desperation, Hjorth came up with a pinning move. Now, of course, capturing the bishop would lose the queen. But what else could he do? Suppose he played rook c5. That's a different pin. But then there's a surprising sacrifice which wraps up the game very quickly. Now, he could try kicking the queen, but from h4, the queen could then go to d8 with a very annoying check that picks off the rook. So, queen b5. That pin will work. Now, the focus of attack changes from f7 to h7. This is a common attacking theme. If you can put pressure on both h7 and f7 when black is castled with the king at g8, it's going to be very hard to defend. Black takes advantage of a checking move, and this must be blocked because to step onto a light square would allow black's bishop to do some damage. Now the pawn is captured and things look pretty good for black. The problem is that after rook to d4, the bishop is still pinned. It's not a question of the bishop moving away and white capturing at c5. Instead, if the bishop moves away, the weak back rank allows rook to d8 with... So, we have a position where black is absolutely powerless to move, must defend the bishop, but after rook f5, the pressure was just too great. It's amusing to look at the final position because there are pins on the d-file and on the fifth rank. The bishop can't be defended and it can't move, so resignation was indeed the appropriate gesture here.